Wait, you're not asking for spoilers, are you?
Notable exceptions, like the original Jurassic Park and Kong Skull Island aside, films featuring giant monsters are notorious for having a human problem.
No, this time we join the fight.
Human characters are necessary for helping to push the story forward, but often they're one-dimensional, lackluster caricatures that don't do much to elevate the movies that they're in. The thing is, if you're going to try and distract me from the giant monster crashing its way through the city with a human subplot, it better be interesting enough that I don't spend the entire time they're on screen wondering when we're getting back to the smashy chompy chompy. If there's a notorious human problem with many kaiju films, imagine how much of an issue it has the potential to be in an entire series. With that in mind, we sat down with showrunners of the upcoming Monarch Legacy of Monsters, Chris Black and Matt Fraction, to discuss how they were going to help their Apple TV Plus series break the mold.
Yeah, it was when we first started talking to Legendary about developing this, and Apple about developing this as a series and taking their feature films and turning them into a television show. I mean, the very first thing we said was this can't be a show about monsters. It won't work if it's a show about monsters. It has to be a show about people who live in a world where monsters actually exist.
Don't take that to mean that you're not going to see any kaiju action, though. Monarch Legacy of Monsters makes sure that the hits keep coming so far as the monster fights and appearances are concerned. And it's not all Godzilla 2014 flashbacks either. Still, there's an art of balance when it comes to keeping your human story engaging enough that you don't spend every moment without Godzilla or any other monsters on screen, wondering when you're going to see them again. When it came to that balance, Black and Fraction had some ideas in mind.
I mean, you just had to approach it as, how would you tell the story of this, this family and this brother and the sister discovering the secret of their father, and that he had betrayed them, and then there was this family legacy that they didn't know anything about, and it sends them on this journey to uncover the mystery of their family. And to just write that story with those characters and create a family and a set of characters that you invest in, their struggle and their trauma and their journey, and then they happen to exist in that larger world.
But what does that larger world look like? Kaiju have a way of making everything seem much smaller than it is, not just in size relativity, but in knocking humans off the top of the food chain. For Fraction and Black, that's where the mystery of Monarch comes in. Fans of Legendary's Monsterverse are familiar with the organization, but up until the Apple TV Plus series, we've never gotten a chance to understand what this whole monster CIA situation is. Still, that familiarity is something that the show's creators kept in mind.
That, it felt like Godzilla fans, Monsterverse fans, hopefully they would come to the show because they have pre-awareness and enthusiasm, but keeping our characters as the audience's point of view, it's a new world to them. Monarch is a new organization to them. Everything our characters are learning, our audience is learning at the same time. And so, we didn't want to make a show that demanded you do homework and have Wikipedia open. We wanted to make something accessible and mysterious, and hopefully in the storytelling that mystery is compelling, and the human drama gives it a real kind of emotional stakes, and staying on the ground with our characters as they navigate this new and terrifying world was kind of our way in a lot of different ways.
That exploration of the human element in a world learning about kaiju and how to exist alongside them is at the core of Monarch Legacy of Monsters. Rather than dealing with the reactions in the moment that we're used to seeing in films, the new show takes time to unwrap not just the PTSD that would come alongside minding your own business when a 400-foot-tall lizard comes out of the ocean, but what it means to live in a world where monsters exist. Dissection of trauma and existing in a complicated world has become a popular theme in media as of late. While there have been varying degrees of success in recent years, Fraction and Black have the right idea when it comes to integrating that element into their story.
Yeah, and for me, it was I just wanted it to be fun. Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's dangerous. There were real stakes. There's trauma. There's loss. There's really high emotion in it. But I wanted it. What was most important to me was to create something that when you saw one episode, you couldn't wait to see the next one, and then you couldn't wait to see the next one.
That high adventure of like cliffhanger story, like serial, the old serials, like it is an adventure show.
Yeah, that you were sending the characters on an adventure that the audience wanted to be on too. That to me was the most, if we accomplished that I would consider to be our greatest success.
That adventure ends up having more twists and turns than one might expect. And Fraction isn't kidding about returning to the cliffhanger aspects of older serialized stories. In addition to the Randa kids trying to figure out what happened to their father, they find themselves deeply entrenched in Monarch's business. As you've likely guessed, Monarch as a whole isn't too pleased with that development. But the time period is important here. While Monarch Legacy of Monsters takes place across 2 key time frames, its most contemporary is after the events of Godzilla 2014. This means that much of what we've learned about Monarch hasn't come to pass yet. So, for the series protagonists, Monarch is still just a shadow operation.
And by picking up right after the events of 2014, we could tell that story as Monarch comes out of the shadows. And what is it like for them to pivot from being, well, there used to be 6 of us in a little room, and then, by the time you get to the films, they're the Avengers, they've got flying things and underwater bases and all that stuff, but we're on that journey. So as our characters are learning about Monarch, about its history and about its mission, we're watching Monarch pivot to becoming that large global voice of confident authority and assuredness in the world of Titans.
Still, much of Legacy of Monsters is less about the Monarch that we know and more about what Monarch was originally meant to be. The organization started with 2 scientists and a smitten military man with hopes of learning more about these giant creatures lurking in the depths. Of course, things are never that simple once you get the government involved, and scientists need funding. By including Monarch's origins, it meant that the Randa family story needed to span generations for Legacy of Monsters purposes. Though, while there were a lot of parallels between the 2 decades depicted, and for that matter, the generations of Randas intertwined with Monarch, much of the similarities are more due to history repeating itself than intentional touchpoints in the story.
I don't know. It's funny. I'd have to think hard on if there was one pivotal kind of point. I think it was a lot more about the continuum of it. That it was like to sort of tell a multi-generational, and this was something that had really originated with Matt, was that to start the story with Bill Randa and the foundation of Monarch, and that to do that you have to go back to the 1940s, 1950s, and then that kind of opened this door into, it's a multi-generational saga from the grandparents to the parents to the children. It's about the sins of the fathers. It's how does this trickle downhill, and how do the events in the past affect, these characters in the present. So it to me, you can't really separate them. Yeah. It's a cascade of kind of trauma and loss that runs down through the decade.
Yeah, the story of the Randa family is the story of Monarch ultimately, and hopefully
the story of our show,
right? And the triumphs and tragedies of the characters in the past have real, relevant, and current influence on the stories in our present, and then there was fun getting to play with how we reveal what those are, what those twists and reversals are. There's still a lot of gaps and questions and mystery to play with, So as our present-day characters are solving this mystery, we're getting answers as they happen, and watching how they kind of cascade downhill and affect everything that happens in the 40s affects 2015.
You can check out Monarch Legacy of Monsters when it hits Apple TV Plus on November 17th. For more on the series, check out our legendary MonsterVerse story so far. And for everything else, stick with IGN.